This movie is inspired by true events. It exposes the dark sides of human trafficking and how they operate across borders, revealing the inhumane conditions and abuse that victims go through at the hands of their abductors. Hello, welcome back to I Am Movies. Today we're looking into a controversial thriller film called Sounds of Freedom. But before we jump into the details, make sure to show us some love by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Now let's get right into it. It all begins in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, where a young girl named Rocio Aguilar is happily singing and drumming in her father's house. A former Cartagena beauty queen named Giselle approaches Rocio's father, Roberto Aguilar, claiming to be from an agency that scouts talented kids for the entertainment industry. She claims she heard Rocio singing from the market, and she'd love to help her get into the industry. At this time, Rocio's younger brother, Miguel Aguilar, also walks in, and Giselle suggests that he'll also fit in. The next day, Roberto takes Rocio and Miguel to the location of the audition where they meet other kids. Giselle tells Roberto to come pick up the kids by 7 p.m. and afterward does some photo shoots with them. However, when Roberto returns to the location to pick up his kids, he finds it empty. With this, Roberto realizes that he's just placed his kids in the hands of traffickers. The kids are placed in a van and subsequently transferred into a shipping container. Meanwhile, in Calexico, California, a man named Tim Ballard, alongside his fellow Homeland Security agents, arrests a man named Ernst Oshinsky for the possession and distribution of child pornography. In Oshinsky's house, Tim finds tons of children's toys and files of different kids that are currently been trafficked, and he breaks down in tears. Later that day, Chris, a fellow agent, tells Tim that he's considering quitting his job, pointing out the fact that they are only able to arrest pedophiles, but they are not able to stop the traffickers or even rescue the kids. Chris's words get to Tim, and in response, he points out the fact that most of the trafficked kids are outside the US. With this, Tim decides to work on some of the recent case files overnight. However, tears soon begin to drop from his eyes as he reports the terrible things the pedophiles do to their victims. Later, Tim visits Oshinsky in his cell. Tim sets him free, and later manages to convince him that he's a pedophile himself to gain Oshinsky's trust. The next day, Tim gets Oshinsky out of detention to further solidify his trust and later strikes a deal with him. The deal involves clearing all of Oshinsky's criminal record in exchange for pleasure with one of his trafficked kids. On hearing this, Oshinsky promises to send one of his fellow traffickers named Earl Buchanan to bring a boy to Tim for the weekend. After receiving all the necessary information, Tim hands over Oshinsky to the police. Tim and his fellow agents track down Earl Buchanan and rescue Miguel the next day. After a medical examination, Miguel was described as having lacerations due to sexual abuse. Afterward, Tim takes Miguel to a restaurant for dinner, and they both begin to bond. The boy reveals to Tim that he's 8 years old and shows him a pendant carrying the name Timoteo, which is the Spanish equivalent of Tim. Miguel reveals to Tim that his abducted sister, Rocio, had given him the pendant, begging him to help rescue his sister. Subsequently, Miguel reveals the ordeal they all went through at the hands of their abductors, and how he was forcefully separated from his sister after being transported to Cartagena. Miguel reveals that it was at this place that he was bought by Earl Buchanan before being flown to the United States and then sold to another woman. Days later, Tim reconnects Miguel with his father, Roberto. Here, Roberto tells Tim that he's not been able to sleep since the day his kids were taken from him. Before leaving for Honduras, Miguel gifts Tim his pendant just to remind him of his promise to rescue her sister, Rocio. Determined to make a change, Tim threatens to extradite Earl Buchanan to a Colombian prison if he doesn't give up all the information he knows about his fellow traffickers. Earl gives up some information about Giselle, revealing that Rocio was transported to Cartagena, Colombia. With this, Tim seeks permission from his boss, Frost, to go to Colombia to rescue Rocio. Although hesitant, Frost agrees to his proposal, and with his wife's approval, Tim sets out on his mission. Subsequently, Tim arrives in Colombia and meets with a police officer named Jorge. Jorge takes Tim to meet with Vampiro, a former Cali cartel money laundering accountant who now works to save children from sex traffickers after serving time in prison. Vampiro buys these kids from their traffickers and then sets them free. Vampiro tells Tim that he knows Giselle as one of the major traffickers in Colombia, revealing that she traffics 10 to 15 kids every week from Central America. Tim begins to look for ways to trap these traffickers, and after reading about a child sex club in Thailand that was shut down, Tim decides that this is the perfect cover story to acquire a large number of Giselle's trafficked children in a sting operation. So Tim tells Vampiro that he wants to set up a sex club in Cartagena that will attract the likes of Giselle. Vampiro buys into this idea, and they decide to set it up. To get Giselle and her gang members, Vampiro lures a trafficker named Calacas to meet with Tim, who poses as a wealthy man ready to build a sex hotel in Cartagena. Vampiro tells Calacas that Tim wants to build a one-of-a-kind member-only hotel with an annual fee of $100,000. On hearing this, Calacas asks Tim how many kids he wants, and Tim requests 50 to 60 kids to kick off the sex hotel. Calacas reveals that he can't do that number alone, and reveals to him that he'll get help from his friends. As soon as Caracas leaves, Jorge trails him to a bar where he pictures him meeting with other major traffickers, including Giselle. Tim sends the pictures to Frost as a lead, but Frost rejects it, stating that DC won't approve of his mission if he's not going after an American child trafficker. With this, Frost orders Tim to get on a plane and return to America immediately. With this, Jorge, Vampiro, Delgado, and Tim all meet up to plan the mission, which involves posing as wealthy pedophiles to lure the sex traffickers to bring as many children as they can to a private island in Cartagena. Shortly after, they get Caracas to fly the traffickers, which include Giselle, Adolfo, and Don Fuego, to meet with them in an expensive condo in Bogotá. During the meeting, Giselle assures them of at least 50 kids and promises more if they are lucky. Later, Tim gets a call from Frost assuring him that he was able to get the support of the US Embassy in Colombia to assist him on his mission. The next day, the team and the Colombian police begin to get the island ready as they wait for the arrival of the traffickers. Moments later, the traffickers arrive with only 30 kids, stating that the rest are on their way. However, this time a new member is introduced to the team. This man happens to be a very influential man named Osorio Rodriguez, or Carne. The traffickers had used Carne's influence as a well-known lawyer to cross borders without any hiccups. Meanwhile, Tim calls Jorge, telling him to separate Carne from the rest of the group during the arrest. Shortly after, they begin to celebrate. Moments later, Carne decides to take one of the boys to an isolated part of the island. However, Tim stops him, stating that the boy belongs to him. Feeling challenged, Carne's bodyguard threatens to shoot Tim. However, Vampiro intervenes and manages to convince Carne to let go, reminding him that he has all night to party. Moments later, the other kids arrive in a boat, and the police invade the place, arresting everyone including Tim and his friends. During the arrest, Giselle asks who had betrayed them, and Tim points out that it's Carne, since he is the only one that wasn't arrested. In the end, the police rescue 54 kids, however. Jorge later reveals to Tim that Rocio is not among the kids. Regardless, Tim watches the kids with a smile on his face, seeing how happy they are to be finally free. So, Tim decides to ask the traffickers about Rocio's current location. One of the traffickers, Don Fuego, reveals that he personally sold Rocio to a drug dealer living in a rebel territory south of the Guitarra River. Jorge reveals to Tim that the area is a no-go area, stating that the police and the army avoid going there. However, Vampiro reveals to them that medical personnel are allowed to enter the island on humanitarian grounds, and Jorge reluctantly agrees to help them obtain documentation to pose as doctors. With this, Vampiro and Tim agree to go to the island as medical personnel, and Jorge also agrees to be their getaway driver. Jorge gives them a GPS tracker and reveals that he won't go past the river with them. Once on the island, they provide some medical services to the locals on their way to the Guitarra River. Days later, they arrive at the foot of the river and set camp there to continue their journey the following day. Early the next day, Vampiro and Tim continue their journey on a boat while Jorge waits for them in the van. As they approach the base, the rebels begin to shoot at them. However, Tim spreads out his arms, revealing that he's just a medical doctor. Regardless, the men threaten to shoot him, instructing them to put their heads down. After a thorough search, the rebels get a go-ahead from their boss, asking them to let only one of the medical staff through. Tim offers to go alone, and they take him with them. At the rebels' camp, Tim realizes that the place is being used for drug operations, as he sees people being used as slaves to cultivate plants for the production of hard drugs. Tim finally meets with the drug lord El Alacran, telling him that there have been cases of cholera outbreaks in the villages around him. Tim asks for his permission to look around for any person who might be infected and evacuate them immediately. However, El Alacran tells him not to evacuate anyone, but instead bring the person to him, suggesting that he will probably kill the person himself. Soon, Tim begins to walk around the camp looking for Rocio. After a while, Tim finds Rocio among a group of people and calls out to her name, but she refuses to answer. However, after adding her surname, she turns around and looks at him in shock. Tim excitedly tries to talk to her in Spanish, attempting to ask her where she sleeps at night. However, El Alcaran interrupts them and asks if Rocio is sick. Tim tells him that she's fine and leaves to check the others. Later that night, Tim silently begins to search for Rocio from one tent to another. After a while, he finds her alone on a bed and taps her to wake up. However, Rocio screams out in fear and later calms down after realizing that it's Tim. On the other hand, El Alcaran, who at this time is having karaoke moments with his boys, hears her scream and decides to go check up on her. Tim sees El Alcaran approaching the hut, and he quickly hides underneath the bed. El Alcaran asks Rocio why she screamed, and she tells him that she had a bad dream. Afterward, El Alcaran picks Rocio up and takes her to his own bed to have an affair with her. However, Tim shows up behind him and subsequently stabs him to death. Afterward, Tim and Rocio begin to run through the jungle as they make attempts to escape. At this time, one of El Alcaran's men finds him dead and immediately raises an alarm. However, Tim and Rocio get into a boat in order to get to the riverside. The rebels begin to shoot at them, but they manage to get into the van in time, with Vampiro and Jorge waiting for them, and they escape the place unscratched. On their way, Tim returns the pendant to Rocio, revealing that he kept his promise to Miguel. Days later, Rocio happily reunites with her father and brother, as they all hug each other with tears. It was later revealed that Tim stayed in Colombia for a while, working with Jorge, to hunt down other sex traffickers in the region. By the time Tim was leaving, he had already rescued over 120 victims and arrested more than a dozen sex traffickers. Also, Tim's testimony about his Colombian operation led the United States Congress to pass legislation that makes international cooperation easier in tackling child trafficking. To date, human trafficking is still a thriving business generating over $150 billion annually, and the United States remains one of the top consumers of child sex. What are your thoughts about the heart-wrenching story? And what do you think is the solution to such serious matter? Let us know in the comment section below. We love to hear from you. Until next time.